There is a particular kind of silence that does not mean peace. It is the silence of a room after someone has been forgotten, not mourned, forgotten. The specific surgical erasure that happens not through violence but through indifference. When a person ceases to matter to the social architecture around them, they do not disappear dramatically. They simply stop registering, like a frequency too low for human ears, present, vibrating, completely undetected. Gotham has known many kinds of silence. The silence after a gunshot in Crime Alley. The silence of a courtroom when a verdict is read. The silence underground in places where justice is administered outside the law, where broken bodies confirm that someone somewhere decided that the scales needed correcting by force. But the silence Batman found when he crossed into the world of Wall Street, into the gleaming, perfumed, mirrored corridors of Manhattan's financial elite, was different from anything he had encountered before. This silence was comfortable. And comfort, he had learned, was the most effective camouflage ever invented. It began, as most of his investigations did, not with a body but with an absence. A woman named Sharon Turner, mid-30s, financial analyst, 3 years at Pierce & Pierce, had stopped existing in the way that people stop existing before they are reported missing. Her desk had been cleared. Her access cards had been deactivated. Her colleagues, when pressed, remembered her with the vague politeness of people describing someone they'd seen once at a conference, present in the periphery, never quite in focus. No one filed a report for 11 days. 11 days. Batman stood in the rain outside the building on a Tuesday night, staring up at the glass tower with the kind of attention most people reserve for things they do not yet understand. He had a file. He had a timeline. He had the beginning of a pattern that under normal circumstances would have resolved into something legible, a motive, a suspect, a network of cause and effect. What he did not have was a crime. The official record showed nothing. Sharon Turner had resigned. Her letter of resignation was dated 3 weeks before anyone noticed she was gone, signed in her own hand, filed correctly through HR. Her apartment lease had been terminated. Her subscriptions canceled. Her social media accounts not deleted, which would have been dramatic and noticeable, but simply inactive, the way accounts go inactive when the person behind them stops caring. She had not been erased violently. She had been processed. That distinction was important. He held it in his mind as he moved through the city, not through alleyways and rooftops the way he usually did, but through lobbies, through restaurants, through the kind of places where the carpet is thick enough to absorb the sound of footsteps and the lighting is calibrated to make everyone look like a more successful version of themselves. He was looking for the mechanism. The second absence was a man named Timothy Reese, investment banker, 41, found eventually, 6 weeks later, in a storage unit in Queens. The medical examiner's report listed the cause of death in clinical language that stripped away everything human about what had happened to him, which Batman suspected was both a professional necessity and an unconscious mercy. But what interested Batman more than the body was what had happened to Timothy Reese before the body. He had been made socially small. Over the course of approximately 3 months, Timothy Reese had been quietly, methodically reduced. His standing at work had eroded through a series of small professional embarrassments, none catastrophic on their own but cumulative in their effect. A misattributed report, a meeting he was not invited to, a client dinner where his chair was placed slightly outside the central cluster of conversation, a promotion that went to someone younger and louder, a parking space reassigned. These were not crimes. They were the ordinary cruelties of corporate life, the background radiation of competitive environments where people are constantly being sorted into relevant and irrelevant. But Batman looked at the timeline and saw something else. He saw deliberation. The pattern was too consistent to be accidental. The intervals between incidents were measured. The escalation was calibrated. Someone had studied Timothy Reese, had understood exactly which social structures he drew his sense of self from, and had proceeded to dismantle them, piece by piece, with the patience and precision of someone who found the process aesthetically interesting. Not angry, not vengeful. Interested. That word settled into Batman's thinking and did not leave. He spent 3 weeks moving through the world he was investigating, and the experience was deeply, fundamentally disorienting in a way that had nothing to do with physical danger. Gotham's criminals, even the sophisticated even the ones who wore suits and ran organizations through layers of legal insulation, operated with a certain emotional legibility. There was greed you could map. There was fear you could leverage. There was ego you could provoke into mistakes. The psychology of crime, in Batman's experience, was always ultimately human in its architecture. People wanted things. People feared things. They acted from those wants and fears in ways that, once understood, became predictable. The world he was walking through now had no such architecture. Or rather, it had architecture. Elaborate, beautiful, meticulously maintained architecture. The restaurants were excellent. The conversations were polished. The people he observed were educated and articulate and capable of discussing art, politics, and philosophy with genuine apparent sophistication. But underneath the architecture, in the place where motivation should have lived, where desire and fear and consequence should have created the emotional weight that makes human behavior legible, there was something that troubled him more than anything he had found in the darkest corners of Gotham. There was performance. Not deception, exactly. Deception implies an authentic self concealed behind a false one. What he was observing was something more unsettling. People for whom the performance was the self, who had constructed identity entirely from external signals. The restaurant they ate at, the suit they wore, the business card they presented, and for whom the question of what existed beneath those signals had simply never arisen. He had read about this. Clinically, theoretically, in the files he kept on psychological profiles of individuals who operated outside conventional moral frameworks. He had encountered narcissism, antisocial personality, the various configurations of human psychology that produced people capable of harm without remorse. But he had never walked through an entire world where this was the ambient condition, where the air itself seemed to have been filtered of moral weight. The third absence connected the first two. Her name was Evelyn Richards. She had worked briefly at the same firm as Sharon Turner. She had attended the same gym, an expensive, members-only facility on the Upper East Side, as Timothy Reese. She had been at the same dinner, documented in a photograph Batman had recovered from a deleted social media archive, as both of them. And she had been at the same dinner as a man named Patrick Bateman. Batman first encountered that name not through an investigation, not through a tip, not through any of the conventional channels through which information about criminals flowed into his orbit. He encountered it the way you encounter ambient sound, not by listening for it, but by noticing, eventually, that it was everywhere. Patrick Bateman, Vice President, Pierce & Pierce, Harvard, business cards printed on bone-white cardstock with tasteful lettering, nightly dinner reservations at restaurants with month-long waiting lists, a physique maintained with the same disciplined intensity most people reserved for professional athletic careers, impeccable clothes, a precisely calibrated social presence, enough warmth to be liked, enough distance to be respected, enough apparent depth to be considered interesting, not enough of anything to be actually known. He appeared in the periphery of all three absences. A colleague who had been present in the office during Sharon Turner's professional decline. A member of the same gym as Timothy Reese, who had been seen speaking with him on 3 separate occasions in the weeks before his isolation began. A friend of Evelyn Richards, or something described as friendship, a social category that in this world seemed to function as aesthetic arrangement rather than genuine attachment. He was not a suspect. There was nothing to be a suspect of officially. But Bateman found him and sat with the information about him, and felt the particular quality of unease that had come to serve as his most reliable investigative instrument. Patrick Bateman was interesting in the way a very still surface of water is interesting. Not because of what you can see, because of what the stillness suggests might be underneath. He began to watch him. Not the aggressive, close surveillance he used on active threats, the kind designed to apply pressure, to communicate presence, to remind a subject that they were seen. Something quieter, observational, the kind of watching that tries not to disturb the thing being watched, because the thing being watched behaves differently when it knows it is observed. Patrick Bateman's routine was a work of art. Not metaphorically, literally, a constructed aesthetic object, designed to communicate a specific impression and executed with a consistency that bordered on the obsessive. He woke at a precise hour. His morning routine, detailed later in ways Bateman found both clinical and deeply strang. Was a sequence of rituals that treated the human body as an object requiring optimization, rather than a self-requiring care. He dressed with the attention of someone for whom clothing was the primary language of identity. He moved through his day, meetings, lunches, client calls, the operational surface of a career that appeared to function correctly without ever suggesting that the person executing it found it meaningful, with a smoothness that should have been reassuring. It was not reassuring. It was, in its very perfection, the most alarming thing Bateman had observed in years of observing alarming things. Because there were moments, small moments, the kind you would not notice if you were not watching with the specific attention Bateman was capable of, where the performance revealed its own nature. A colleague told a joke. The room laughed. Patrick Bateman laughed. But Bateman, watching the timing, watching the calibration of the response, saw that the laugh had been placed rather than produced, inserted into the moment at the socially appropriate interval, at the socially appropriate volume, with the socially appropriate duration. Correct, exact, utterly empty. A client complimented him. He received the compliment with apparent pleasure, the modest deflection, the small smile, the expression of professional satisfaction. But the pleasure did not reach anything. It processed on the surface and dissolved. Nothing went inward. Bateman had spent years learning to read people. It was a survival skill, a detective skill, a skill built from the terrible education of loss and the long discipline of learning how to move through a world where misjudging another person's psychology could be fatal. He knew how people looked when they concealed emotion. He knew the tells, the micro-expressions, the physical tension, the quality of breath, the slight hesitations that betrayed the gap between what was being shown and what was being felt. Patrick Bateman did not show those tells. Not because he was better at concealment than anyone Bateman had ever encountered, but because there did not appear to be anything to conceal. He pulled the financial records. He cross-referenced the social calendars. He built the map of intersections, where Bateman's routine had overlapped with the routines of the 3 people who had ceased to exist, and spread it across the workstation in the Batcave with the careful attention he gave to things he was trying to understand before he could explain them. The pattern was there. Not smoking gun obvious. Nothing in this world was smoking gun obvious, which he was beginning to understand was itself a designed feature rather than an accident. But there, in the way that a shape is present in a photograph even when you cannot quite name what you're looking at. Bateman had been proximate to all three. He had been socially connected to all three in the weeks before their reduction began. And in each case, the reduction had followed a particular sequence: social erosion first, professional diminishment second, physical isolation third, that had the quality of a method, of a practice, of something done before, refined, improved. Bateman sat in the dark and thought about what kind of person develops a method for this. Not rage. Rage was messy, reactive, driven by need. Rage left evidence. Not hatred, at least not the kind of hatred born from conflict, from injury, from the desire for revenge against someone who had done something. He could find no connection between Bateman and any of his victims that would produce that kind of motivation. What he was looking at required patience. It required observation. It required the ability to study a human being with enough precision to identify exactly which social structures they depended on for their sense of existing as a person, and then to dismantle those structures with enough subtlety that no single act ever registered as a crime. It required, above all, a kind of interest in the process itself, which meant that what was driving this was not emotional in any conventional sense. It was aesthetic. Someone was doing this because they found it interesting, because the act of reducing a human being, of watching the social architecture of a person's existence crumble under carefully applied pressure, produced in them something that functioned like engagement, like stimulation. Not pleasure exactly, not cruelty in the sense of deriving satisfaction from another's pain. Something colder, more abstract. The way an entomologist pins a specimen. He came to a conclusion that night that he would spend the rest of this investigation testing, revising, and ultimately finding he had not been wrong about. This was not a case in the traditional sense. There was no crime scene, or rather, there were crime scenes everywhere, distributed across the social fabric of a world that had been engineered to make them invisible. There was no single decisive act to investigate, no moment of violence around which evidence could be organized and a case constructed. What there was instead was a system in which a certain kind of person could operate, could hunt, in the most precise sense of that word, with complete impunity, not because they were clever enough to evade justice, but because the environment itself filtered out the possibility of justice being applied to them. The social world of Manhattan's financial elite was not complicit in what was happening. That would have required awareness, and awareness required the ability to perceive something as wrong, and that perception had been made structurally unavailable. When Sharon Turner disappeared from her desk, her colleagues did not ask where she had gone because asking would have required assigning weight to her existence that the culture of the environment did not support. She had been, in the ambient language of that world, not important enough to notice. When Timothy Reese began his descent, no one intervened because intervention would have required identifying what was happening as a thing that was being done to him, rather than as the ordinary operation of competitive professional environments, where people are sorted by success and failure. When Evelyn Richards stopped returning calls, she was filed, without examination, in the category of people who had become inconvenient to know. The system did not protect Patrick Bateman. The system generated him. And that Bateman understood, standing in the rain outside a glass tower that reflected nothing but its own gleaming surface back at the world, was going to make this the hardest thing he had ever tried to do. Not because the enemy was strong, but because the enemy was invisible in a way that had nothing to do with shadows. He looked up at the building. Somewhere above him, separated by floors of steel and glass, and the ambient noise of a world that had decided certain things did not need to be seen, a man was at dinner. He was ordering something from a menu he had memorized. He was engaging in conversation with the precise calibration of someone who understood social interaction as a system to be navigated rather than a human exchange to be had. He was, by every external measure, a successful and unremarkable member of a class of people that this city treated as its operational center of gravity. He was also, Bateman was now certain, in the way he was certain of things that the evidence suggested but had not yet proven, a predator. Not metaphorically, literally. And the world around him had been designed, whether intentionally or through the long accumulated logic of a culture that valued surface over substance, to make that invisible. Bateman turned and walked back into the dark. He had work to do. Not the work of finding a criminal. The work of making a crime legible in a world that had decided not to see it. That, he understood, was going to require something he had never quite needed before. Not justice. There is a philosophical question that most people never need to ask because the answer is assumed before the question forms. Is there someone home? Not in a building, not in a room, in a person. Behind the eyes, behind the performance of expression and response and social navigation, is there an interior, a self that experiences rather than simply processes, a place where things land and register and mean something beyond their function as social data? We assume yes. We have to. The entire architecture of human civilization, law, morality, empathy, love, justice, rests on that assumption the way a building rests on its foundation. Remove it and nothing above it makes structural sense. So we don't remove it. We extend it automatically, generously, to everyone we encounter, because the alternative is a kind of cognitive vertigo that most minds will do almost anything to avoid. Bateman had spent his life studying people who had compromised that interior, who had damaged it, suppressed it, weaponized it. Criminals who had built walls around their capacity for empathy. Killers who had learned to treat the discomfort of conscience as noise to be managed. Even the worst of them, the ones who operated at the furthest edges of what human psychology could produce, had retained, somewhere in the architecture, the ghost of an interior. A place where something had once lived, even if it lived there no longer. What he found when he studied Patrick Bateman, really studied him, with the depth of attention he reserved for problems that refused to resolve into familiar shapes, was different. Not a damaged interior. Not a suppressed one. The question was whether there had ever been one at all. He established close observation on a Wednesday. Not physical proximity, not yet. He was not ready for Bateman to know he existed. That moment would come, and when it came it would need to be precisely calibrated, because Bateman had already understood that the dynamics of this situation did not respond to the usual application of pressure. For now, he watched from the outside. Through the sophisticated surveillance architecture he had spent years building into the city's own infrastructure. Through the information networks that fed him data about movement and pattern, and the social mechanics of environments he was not physically present in. He watched and he listened, and he built a picture. And the picture disturbed him in ways he found difficult to articulate even to himself, which was itself unusual. Batman was not a person who struggled to articulate things. Language was a tool he had disciplined himself to use with precision, because in his work imprecision cost lives. He named things. He labeled them. He reduced complexity to its operational components and worked from there. But Patrick Bateman resisted naming. Not because he was complex. That was the paradox at the center of this. He resisted naming because he was, in a sense that kept revealing new dimensions of itself, profoundly simple. Batman internal. He moves through his morning with the efficiency of someone who has optimized the self as a system. 45 minutes of precisely calibrated physical exercise. I've studied the logs from the gym, the specific sequence of machines, the intervals, the weight progressions. There is no variation. Day to day, week to week, the routine is identical, not the consistency of someone who has found what works for their body. The consistency of someone for whom variation would introduce an aesthetic imperfection into a sequence that has been designed. His skincare routine takes 23 minutes. I know this because I timed it across 14 consecutive mornings using the building's own security feed. 23 minutes, in the same order, with the same products, applied in the same sequence. He does this with the focused attention of a craftsman. The expression on his face during this process is the closest thing to contentment I have observed on him. He is making himself. Every morning, he constructs the surface that will interface with the world for the day. And in the quality of his attention during that construction, in the care, the precision, the satisfaction, I see something that I think might be the truest thing about him. The surface is not concealing the self. The surface is the self. Which means that what I am looking for, the interior that should explain the behavior, the psychological engine that drives the method, the place where I can find the human being committing these acts, may not exist in the form I am looking for. And if that's true, then everything I know about how to stop a person needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. My pores this morning appear slightly enlarged near the nose. I will need to address this. The new exfoliant from Biotherm is performing adequately, but I wonder if the La Mer alternative would produce superior results. I make a note. I will research this at lunch. In the mirror, the jaw is clean, the neck without blemish. The physique is correct, 8% body fat, perhaps slightly less. The suit today is Armani, the charcoal with the faint chalk stripe that reads, in certain lighting conditions, as more expensive than it actually is, which is itself an interesting social experiment I have been running informally for 3 weeks. No one has noticed, or rather, they have noticed the impression and not examined the source. This is consistent with my broader observations about how status operates in this environment. The signal matters. The substance of the signal is largely irrelevant. I feel here I pause, because the word feel requires some precision. I register something in the vicinity of satisfaction. Whether this is what others mean by satisfaction I cannot determine from the inside. It functions adequately as a motivational state. I proceed. Today, morning client meeting, the Hendricks account. Lunch at Nabu, I called ahead. The reservation is confirmed, table 14, which has the correct sightline for observing who else is dining and whether anyone worth noting notes me. Afternoon at the office. Evening, I am considering a new project. I have been considering it for some time. The woman from the Carver account, I have been watching her. She does not know this. She would not notice if she did. Very few people have the attention required to notice when they are being watched with genuine interest. Most people are too concerned with whether they are being liked to observe whether they are being studied. She seems, from a distance, like someone whose existence produces a kind of mild social friction. Not enough to be dramatic, not enough to draw attention, but enough that her absence would be received with something like relief. I find myself engaged by the problem of her. I return to my routine. The client meeting was in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that looked, from his altitude, purely aesthetic. The people in the room had the slightly abstracted quality of people who have spent enough time above street level that the ground has lost its realness. They spoke in the language of this environment, a language composed of numbers, projections, risk assessments, the careful management of other people's money as an exercise in applied confidence, with the fluency of those for whom the language had become the only language. Bateman had access to the audio. He listened not to the content, but to the performance. Patrick Bateman performed the meeting with a technical excellence that was, in its own way, remarkable. He knew when to speak and when to defer. He knew which observations would land as intelligent without threatening the egos of the senior people in the room. He navigated the subtle dominance hierarchies of the table, who sat where, who interrupted whom, who received the nods of acknowledgement that indicated their contribution had been registered as valuable, with the precision of someone who had mapped the terrain exhaustively and moved through it without ever appearing to think. But here was what Bateman noticed, listening with the specific attention he had now calibrated for this subject. Bateman never lost himself in the meeting. There is a quality to human engagement, genuine engagement, the kind where a person is actually present in what is happening, that produces a certain kind of attention drift, enthusiasm, irritation, the small involuntary responses that occur when something matters, when the stakes are real, when the outcome connects to something the person actually cares about. Even the most controlled people in Bateman's experience showed this in small ways. A fractional change in vocal warmth when a point went well, a tightening around the eyes when something frustrated them. Bateman showed none of this. He was in the meeting the way a very good actor is in a scene, fully present to the technical execution, entirely absent from genuine experience of it. The meeting ended. He shook hands, he smiled, he left. In the elevator, alone for 40 seconds before the doors opened on the lobby floor, Bateman watched his face go blank. Not relaxed, not tired, not relieved to be done. Blank. The performance had ended. The face had returned to its resting state, which was not an expression at all, not peace, not contemplation, not even the vague, neutral affect of someone simply not currently performing. It was the face of a screen, when nothing is being displayed. I have interviewed sociopaths. I have sat across tables from people who committed acts that the clinical literature struggles to categorize, and I have looked into their eyes and worked to understand what was driving them. In almost every case, there was a thing driving them, a need for control, for recognition, for the relief of anxiety through external action, for the restoration of some internal equilibrium that had been disrupted. The need was the handle. The need was how you got purchase on a person. Bateman has no visible need. He eats dinner at the correct restaurant because it is the correct restaurant. He wears the correct suit because it is the correct suit. He performs the correct emotions in the correct social contexts because the performance is what the context requires. There is no evidence in weeks of observation, across hundreds of data points, of anything beneath the performance that the performance serves. I keep looking for the wound. In everyone I have ever investigated, everyone who has ever crossed the line into what we call evil, for want of a more precise word, there has been a wound, an origin, a place where the interior was damaged in some specific way that then organized the person's behavior around that damage. I am not naive about this. Understanding the wound does not excuse the behavior. does not reduce the obligation to stop it. But the wound is what makes a person legible. It is the grammar of the damage. I cannot find Bateman's wound. I am beginning to consider the possibility that the wound is the absence. That what I am looking at is not a damaged person, but the presence of a human nervous system without the architecture that makes damage register as damage, without the interior that would need to be wounded for a wound to exist. If that's true, then this is not about trauma. This is about the absence of the equipment that would experience trauma. And I do not know what you do with that. Lunch at Nabu. Bateman had a contact in the restaurant industry, someone who owed him a category of favor that did not expire, and he used that contact to access the audio capture from a table near Bateman's. The quality was imperfect. Ambient noise from a busy restaurant is not a controlled environment for surveillance, but he had worked with worse. Bateman was lunching with 2 colleagues and a client. The client was from out of town, Chicago, based on the accent, and was doing the slightly heightened performance of someone in a new city who wants to demonstrate that they are comfortable in expensive restaurants. The colleagues were running the particular kind of competitive bonhomie that passes for friendship among people who are also assessing each other's professional utility. Bateman hosted. That was the right word. He hosted the lunch the way a very good restaurant hosts a dinner, creating the conditions for other people's comfort, smoothing the conversational surface, ensuring that the pacing was correct, that the right wines appeared at the right times, that the client felt both well-attended and subtly impressed without being made to feel the impression was being manufactured. It was, Bateman admitted, genuinely impressive. And yet, midway through the main course, the client said something moderately funny, not hilarious, not memorable, the kind of lunch table observation that produces a brief collective lightening of atmosphere before the conversation moves on. The colleagues laughed. Bateman laughed. Bateman had recorded this moment, and he played it back 6 times. Because in the half-second before Bateman's laugh began, in the interval between the client's punchline landing and the social response being required, Bateman saw something that the naked eye in real time would have missed entirely. A calculation. Not thought, not the processing of what had been said. A flat, rapid, functional assessment. This moment requires laughter. Duration, moderate. Volume, appropriate to context. Begin. And then the laugh, perfectly executed. The client felt liked. The colleagues felt at ease. And Patrick Bateman returned, behind the performance, to wherever Patrick Bateman actually was, which appeared to be nowhere at all. Batman internal. The client Harrison from the Chicago office has a tell when he's uncertain, a slight raising of the left shoulder almost imperceptible that precedes any statement he's not confident about. I noticed this at the beginning of the meal and have been tracking it. He has raised his left shoulder 4 times. Each time, he followed the gesture with a statement he then softened with humor. He is seeking approval while performing confidence. This is common. Most people in rooms like this are performing confidence while seeking something. I find myself watching him with something I can only describe as mild curiosity. The way one might observe an insect navigating an obstacle without particularly caring whether it succeeds. The wine is a 2018 Barossa Valley Shiraz. It is correct. Not exceptional, but correct for this table, this client, this context. My colleague Whitfield is wearing a suit that is attempting to communicate something its quality cannot support. I find this faintly embarrassing on his behalf, though I note that the embarrassment I feel is not on his behalf. I am incapable of feeling things on behalf of others, I have determined. The embarrassment is aesthetic. A flaw in the composition of the table. I correct my posture slightly. The woman, Jameson, from the Carver account, sent an email this morning that I find I have read several times, not because of its content, because of what the email communicates about her awareness of her own position. She is beginning to notice that she is being made peripheral. She has not identified the mechanism. She describes it in her email to her colleague. I have her email. I have everyone's email who interests me. This has been the case for some time, as a vague feeling of being overlooked. She is not being overlooked. She is being very carefully seen. There is a difference. I eat. The food is technically accomplished. I register this. I pay the bill, which is substantial, which is the point of the bill. I leave. The afternoon passed in the register of a career that functioned correctly. Meetings, calls, the operational surface of a life organized around the markers of success rather than the experience of it. Bateman tracked it with the patient attention of someone building a complete picture, not looking for any single piece, but for the way all the pieces related to each other. What he was building was a portrait of a man for whom the entire external architecture of human life, the career, the possessions, the social relationships, the body maintained to a precise aesthetic standard, the reservations at the correct restaurants, the business cards printed on the correct card stock, existed not as the expression of an inner life, but as a replacement for one. This was the thing he kept returning to, the thing that refused to resolve into a simpler shape. Patrick Bateman had not abandoned the interior in favor of the surface. He had never, as far as Bateman could determine, made the journey inward at all, which meant that what Bateman was observing was not a person concealing their true self behind a performance. It was a performance that had become convinced it was a person. Man internal. I understand, theoretically, the clinical literature, antisocial personality, psychopathy, the spectrum of presentations that involve reduced or absent empathic response, shallow affect, the use of others as instruments. I know the research. I know the brain imaging studies. I know the arguments about nature and nurture and the degree to which these presentations are fixed versus responsive to intervention. But I am learning something that the literature does not quite capture. The literature treats the absence of empathy as a deficit, as a thing that is missing, a function that failed to develop or was suppressed or damaged. And that framing, I realize, still assumes an interior that has been depleted, a container that is empty. What I am looking at may not be a container. It may be something that was never designed to hold anything. Bateman moves through the world collecting data about the world. He learns its rules. He masters its performances. He navigates its social systems with extraordinary competence. He is, in the functional sense, extremely successful at being in the world. But he is not in the world the way other people are in the world. He is in the world the way a very sophisticated instrument is in the world. Gathering, processing, executing. Without experience. And the question that keeps surfacing, the one I cannot push aside. If that's what he is, if experience genuinely does not occur inside him, then what exactly am I supposed to threaten? Fear requires an interior that can be frightened. Guilt requires an interior that can be burdened. Consequence requires an interior that can register loss. I have built my entire method on the assumption that those interiors exist. What do I do when they don't? Evening. Bateman shifted from passive observation to something closer to presence. Not contact, not yet, but proximity. He moved through the same physical spaces Bateman moved through, separated by the careful distance of someone who was studying without being studied. He watched Bateman at a gallery opening, a charity event, the kind that attracts the specific subset of wealthy people for whom philanthropy functions primarily as a social activity, where the cause is secondary to the gathering, and the gathering is secondary to the accumulation of social credit. Bateman worked the room. There was no other word for it. He moved through the gathered people with the systematic efficiency of someone conducting an inventory. He spent exactly the right amount of time with each cluster of people, enough to register as present and engaged, not enough to create any obligation of depth. He said the correct things about the art on the walls, which he had clearly researched in advance, because his observations were accurate without being personal, informed without suggesting genuine response. He donated. The amount was calibrated, generous enough to be noticed, precise enough not to seem excessive. He was seen by everyone, known by no one. And Bateman, watching from across the room with the expression of a person who had come to look at the art, realized something that landed with the weight of things that rearrange other things. Patrick Bateman was lonely in a way that was entirely invisible to him. Not the loneliness of someone who desires connection and cannot find it. That loneliness has texture, has pain, has the quality of absence felt. The loneliness of someone for whom the concept of connection had never acquired content. He was surrounded by people and isolated in a way that went deeper than circumstance. He was isolated in his own experience of existing. And that isolation, Bateman understood, with the particular clarity that sometimes comes at the end of a long period of gathering, was not a consequence of what he had done. It was the condition that made what he did possible. The predation was not a departure from who he was. It was the only form of engagement available to him. The only context in which the blankness of his interior was replaced, briefly, temporarily, insufficiently, by something that functioned like aliveness. Bateman internal. The gallery is correctly attended. I identify 7 people worth speaking to. I speak to all 7. I identify 3 people who will remember this interaction as having been meaningful. I ensure that they will. There is a woman near the second installation, abstract, oversized, the kind of work that announces its own importance, who is looking at the piece with the expression of someone who is performing appreciation they do not feel. I recognize this because I am familiar with the performance. I feel something in her direction that I identify, after a moment's consideration, as recognition. Not sympathy, recognition. She is doing what I do, but worse, and for smaller stakes. I move on. At these events, I sometimes experience something I can only describe as a low hum of dissatisfaction that has no specific object. Not unhap. Pinus, I am not familiar with unhappiness as a sustained state, only as a temporary signal that conditions are not optimal. This is different. Diffuse. Present beneath the correct execution of the evening like a frequency below hearing. I have tried to identify its source. The closest I have come, the world does not provide sufficient stimulus. The interactions are correct but not interesting. The people are navigable but not engaging. The food is technically accomplished. The wine is appropriate. The art is competently produced. Nothing requires my actual attention. Everything requires my performance. There is a difference, I think, though I am not certain I experience the difference as a problem. On the way home, I find myself thinking, not for the first time, about the Jameson woman, about the project I have been designing around her, about the specific sequence of events I have been planning. I notice that when I think about this, the low hum recedes. I make a note of this. Data. Bateman left the gallery 20 minutes after Bateman did. He stood on the street outside and let the city sound wash over him. The ambient noise of a metropolis that never fully slept. The sirens and traffic and distant voices that formed the constant acoustic backdrop of urban life. He thought about what he had spent the last several weeks learning. He had gone into this investigation looking for a criminal. He had found something that required a different vocabulary. Patrick Bateman was not a man who had decided to do terrible things. He was a man for whom the category of terrible had never been installed. The crimes, and Bateman was now as certain as he needed to be that crimes were occurring, even if the evidentiary architecture to prove them was still being assembled, were not departures from his normal functioning. They were expressions of it. The targeting, the patient, systematic reduction of a human being to the status of a problem being solved, the final physical act that ended the project. These were not explosions of something held back. They were the logical extensions of a psychology that experienced other people primarily as objects of aesthetic interest, interesting while they were interesting, and then not. Bateman had stopped people who killed for money, for power, for the relief of internal pressure that had built to a point where violence felt like the only release, for ideology, for love even, in its most catastrophically distorted forms. He did not know how to stop someone who killed because other people, when reduced to their most vulnerable, produced in him the only sensation that approximated engagement. That was the problem he was walking into. And the problem was harder than anything physical. Because you could not threaten what did not register threat. You could not punish what did not experience consequence. You could not reach something that had never learned to be reached. He stood on the street for a long time. Above him, in a building that reflected only its own surface back at the world, a man was preparing for bed with the precision of a ritual, applying products, setting the alarm, lying in the dark with the blank contentment of a machine in standby mode. Waiting without knowing it was waiting, for something interesting to begin. Bateman turned up his collar against the wind and started moving. Somewhere in the gap between what he knew and what he needed to know, the shape of a next step was beginning to form. It was not going to be comfortable. None of what came next was going to be comfortable. But comfort had never been the point. The point was to find out if you could impose consequence on a man for whom consequence was a foreign language. The point was to find out if justice had any purchase on an empty room. He would learn the answer. One way or another, he would learn it. There is a particular miscalculation that even the most disciplined minds make when they enter unfamiliar territory. They assume the rules of the familiar still apply. Not consciously, not naively. The assumption runs deeper than thought. It is baked into method, into reflex, into the practice sequences of action that have worked before, and therefore carry the weight of expected reliability. You do not question what has never failed you. You do not redesign the tool that has always performed correctly. Bateman had a method. It had been built across years of iteration, refined by failure, sharpened by consequence, tested against the full range of what human darkness could produce. It was not a simple method. It was not brutal or blunt. It was, in its own way, as psychologically sophisticated as anything in the clinical literature on human behavior under pressure. The method had a fundamental architecture. Find the weakness, apply pressure, force a response, read the response, redirect toward the outcome justice requires. Every person had a weakness. Every person, under sufficient pressure, produced a response. And every response, properly read, revealed the next point of leverage. This was not cruelty. It was mechanics. The mechanics of the human interior, which Bateman had spent his adult life learning to operate as fluently as other people operated their native language. He had never encountered a subject for whom the fundamental architecture did not apply. He was about to. The decision to move from observation to engagement was not made lightly. He spent 2 days with the accumulated data, the weeks of surveillance, the financial records, the social mapping, the evidence of what he was increasingly certain were multiple victims in various stages of a process that ended badly, and ran the calculation the way he ran all calculations that involved significant risk. What did engagement cost? What did continued observation cost? What was the probability distribution of outcomes across the range of possible approaches? The answer that kept surfacing was uncomfortable. Every day of continued observation was another day of the project Bateman was running on the woman from the Carver account. Her name was Diana Jameson, 32, good at her job, recently promoted, exactly the kind of person whose professional visibility had made her, in Bateman's particular calculus, interesting. The erosion process had been running for 6 weeks. Bateman had tracked it in the granular detail of someone watching a slow-motion disaster, with insufficient ability to intervene. Her meeting invitations had declined. Her contributions in shared project spaces had begun to be attributed, in subtle and deniable ways, to others. A client she had cultivated for 18 months had been, through a series of social maneuvers Bateman could now reconstruct step by step, gently redirected toward a colleague. She had not been harassed. She had not been threatened. She had been made, systematically and with extraordinary patience, to feel professionally weightless. Bateman had seen where this process ended. He could not watch it end again. So he made the decision. He would let Bateman know he was there. He started with the business cards. It was, on the surface, a small thing, an almost absurd place to begin dismantling a man. But Bateman had learned, across years of studying how identity operated in people for whom identity was primarily a constructed external object, that small disruptions to the symbolic architecture of that construction could produce disproportionate internal effects. Patrick Bateman's business cards were not trivial to him. They were not, in the way most people's professional materials are professional materials, functional, forgettable, serving the administrative purpose of transferring contact information. They were, as far as Bateman's observation could determine, a primary object of identity investment. The weight of the card stock, the precise font, the positioning of the name relative to the title, these were not aesthetic preferences. They were load-bearing elements of a self-concept that was constructed almost entirely from the outside in. Bateman had the cards duplicated. Not exactly. That would have been forgery, and forgery was not the point. The point was substitution with a difference subtle enough to be unsettling without being immediately identifiable as tampering. The card stock was fractionally lighter, the font marginally thicker. The result was a card that, to most people in most circumstances, would be indistinguishable from the original. But not to Bateman. He left 12 of them, distributed through the correct pockets, the correct card case, inserted with the precision that required intimate knowledge of Bateman's organizational habits, which Bateman had, and waited. Bateman internal. I know this seems disproportionate. An investigation into what I believe are multiple homicides, and I begin by tampering with business cards. But I need to understand something before I escalate. I need to understand what registers. The conventional opening moves, making a subject aware they are under investigation, applying institutional pressure, leveraging the fear of exposure, assume a psychological architecture that responds to those moves. They assume that the subject experiences something when they know they are being watched. Anxiety, alertness, the specific discomfort of a person who has done things they know are wrong and now fears those things being brought into the light. I cannot assume that about Bateman, not yet. So I start here, with something small and precise and designed not to frighten him, but to produce a specific quality of response. I want to see what he does when his world contains something that shouldn't be there. How he processes anomaly. What the anomaly reveals about the interior that processes it. The cards are not a weapon. They're a question. He did not have to wait long. The following morning, Bateman went through his preparation ritual with the usual precision. Batman watched via F.E.D. he had established in the building's infrastructure. Not inside the apartment, which would have crossed a line he was not prepared to cross at this stage, but in the lobby camera, angled to capture the moment of exit with sufficient resolution to read expression. Bateman emerged at the usual time, dressed with the usual exactness, carrying the card case in the usual pocket. At the lobby, he stopped. He took out the card case. He removed a card, he held it. Batman watched his face. And what he saw was not what he had expected. He had expected irritation, the low-level frustration of a controlled person encountering something that violated their controlled environment. He had expected, perhaps, the careful blankness of someone who suspected surveillance and was managing their response to it. What he saw instead was something that took him a full 30 seconds to correctly identify. Interest. Not alarm. Not anger, not the self-protective recalibration of a predator who realizes it may have become prey. The expression that crossed Patrick Bateman's face when he held the substituted card was the closest thing to genuine engagement Batman had ever observed on him. He held the card for 11 seconds. Batman timed it, and 11 seconds is a very long time to hold a business card in a lobby, and then returned it to the case with the deliberate care of someone handling something significant. He continued to work. Batman sat with what he had observed and felt the first tremor of a realization that would, over the following weeks, develop into something he found genuinely troubling. Bateman had not been disturbed by the anomaly. He had been stimulated by it. The card is wrong. Not wrong in a way that most people would identify. The difference is at the threshold of perceptibility, and most people operate well below that threshold when it comes to details they have not trained themselves to notice. But I have trained myself. The weight is off by a margin I estimate at 6 to 8%. The font weight is slightly increased. The cardstock has a different surface quality under the thumb. Someone has been in my things. I consider this on the elevator, on the way to the car, during the first 15 minutes of the commute. Someone has been in my things, has studied my things with sufficient precision to replicate them with near fidelity, and has replaced them with replicas that differ only in ways I would notice. This is interesting. I have not previously been the subject of this quality of attention. People watch me. I am aware of being watched. I understand that my surface produces a certain quality of attention in others, a kind of aesthetic response that manifests as observation. I have cataloged this. I am used to it. This is different. This is the attention of someone who is not watching the surface. This is someone looking for something underneath. I notice that I am thinking about this with a quality of engagement I do not often experience. Something has shifted in the ambient register of the day. The low hum of insufficiency that usually accompanies my mornings is absent. Something interesting is happening. I proceed to the office. But I am, for the first time in longer than I can precisely determine, genuinely curious about what comes next. The second intervention was more direct. Batman accessed Bateman's calendar, not difficult, given the sophistication of the tools he had at his disposal, and made a single modification. A lunch reservation, confirmed for the following Tuesday at a restaurant Bateman had been attending monthly for 3 years, was canceled. Not the reservation itself, the record of the reservation. The restaurant system showed the booking intact. Bateman's calendar showed it canceled. This was designed to produce a specific kind of friction. Not dramatic friction, not the friction of confrontation or exposure. The friction of a world that had, in a small but precise way, stopped cooperating. The mechanisms of Bateman's life ran, Batman had observed, on a quality of seamlessness. Things proceeded correctly. Reservations were honored. Systems responded as expected. The world, for someone of his social position and his careful management of the variables of his environment, largely did what it was supposed to do. This seamlessness was not incidental. It was a designed feature of his existence, maintained with ongoing effort, because a world that ran correctly was a world that confirmed the validity of the surface he had constructed. Disrupting the seamlessness was not about causing him inconvenience. It was about introducing noise into a signal he relied on. About making him aware that the environment he controlled was controllable by someone else. 3 weeks in, I have introduced 7 disruptions, each small, each precisely calibrated, each designed to produce a specific quality of response rather than immediate escalation. The business cards, the calendar, a dry sea. Leaning order that was correctly placed and then subtly altered. A guest list for a charity event where his name appeared in the correct position, but with an infinitesimal change to his title. A parking reservation that existed in the building system, but was not reflected in the confirmation he received. In every case, I am doing what he does. I am reducing his world in small ways, making it slightly less solid, introducing the experience of being in an environment that is not entirely under his control. The mirror of his method. And in every case, his response has been the same. Not fear. Not anger. Engagement. He is solving the puzzle of me. I can see it in the behavioral data, the way his pattern has shifted slightly, become slightly less predictable, as if he is leaving himself available to whatever comes next. He has not gone to authorities. He has not increased his security. He has not, as far as I can determine, confided in anyone. He is treating this as a private dialogue, which means he knows it is a dialogue, which means he has already understood something I am only beginning to understand. He is not experiencing this as a threat. He is experiencing it as company. The realization arrived fully formed on a Thursday night. Batman was reviewing the behavioral data, the subtle shifts in Bateman's pattern over the 3 weeks since he had begun the interventions, and the shape that emerged from the data was one he had not predicted and found, now that he could see it clearly, deeply unsettling in ways that went beyond the professional. Bateman's project on Diana Jameson had slowed. Not stopped. The erosion process was still running, but the pace had changed, the intervals between incidents had lengthened, the escalation had plateaued. The methodical progression toward the endpoint had, for reasons that the data alone could not explain, decelerated. Bateman looked at the timeline. The deceleration had begun precisely when the interventions had begun. He sat with this for a long time. He had a hypothesis, and he tested it against the evidence, and the evidence kept confirming it, and he kept hoping the next data point would disconfirm it, and it didn't. Patrick Bateman's project on Diana Jameson had slowed because something more interesting had entered his environment. Bateman had entered his environment. And in the psychological economy of a man for whom other people were primarily objects of varying interest, the new and complex stimulus had temporarily displaced the old and nearly resolved one. He had not disrupted the predator. He had given the predator something better to hunt. This is the thing I failed to anticipate, the thing that no framework I have prepared gives me adequate tools for. I am not a deterrent to him. I am a development. He does not experience my presence as danger. He experiences it as the word that keeps presenting itself. The one I keep trying to replace with something more operationally useful is stimulation. I am the most interesting thing in his environment. I am the puzzle that has no obvious solution. I am the anomaly that resists his usual methods of processing. In a life defined by surfaces and performances, and the management of a world that has become entirely predictable, I am the first unpredictable thing. And I realize, with a cold clarity that arrives not as a thought but as a physical sensation somewhere in the chest, that I have made an error. Not a tactical error, a conceptual one. I assumed that making myself known to him would create pressure. Instead, I have created interest. And interest, in Bateman's psychological economy, is the most valuable commodity there is. Which means I have accidentally given him something. The question now is whether I can use that gift as a lever, or whether it will simply integrate me into his world in a way that serves his purposes more than mine. He needed to recalibrate. The interventions continued, but their nature shifted. Bateman moved from the small, precise disruptions designed to produce observable responses and toward something more deliberate, more confrontational. He was done asking questions with modified business cards and calendar entries. He needed to test the boundary directly. He left a note. Not anonymous, not threatening. 7 words written in a hand that was clearly not careless, deliberate strokes, the hand of someone who wanted the recipient to understand that care had been taken. I know what you are, so do you. He left it in the card case, replacing one of the substituted cards. 7 words. I read them 3 times, not because they are difficult to parse, but because I want to hold the moment. Extend it. Something about this moment has a quality I associate with I search for the correct word's significance, which is unusual. Most moments do not have this quality. Most moments are operationally functional and aesthetically accessible, but not significant in any way that exceeds their function. Or aesthetic value. This moment is different. Someone knows. Not in the way that the word knows is usually used, the institutional knowledge of law enforcement, the evidentiary knowledge of a prosecution, the social knowledge of someone who has seen something they should not have seen. Those forms of knowing have a predictable architecture. They lead to predictable consequences which can be anticipated and managed. This is different. This person, whoever they are, whatever they are, knows in the way that implies genuine understanding, not just of what I have done, of what I am. I have never been known before. I have been performed at. I have been socially engaged with. I have been professionally respected and occasionally personally liked, in the shallow way that people like surfaces they find pleasant. I have been feared twice, briefly, by people who had reason for fear. I have never been known. I sit with the card for a long time. The hum is completely absent. For the first time in memory, the ambient insufficiency that defines my existence has been replaced by something I can only describe as attention. As if the world has, for this moment, resolved into focus. I am being watched by something that sees me. I find that I want to be seen. I find that I want to respond. Batman had set up the meeting deliberately. Not a confrontation, not yet, not physically. A presence. He chose a location Bateman frequented, a bar attached to a hotel where Bateman occasionally had evening drinks with the category of people he performed friendship for, and he was there in civilian clothes at a corner table when Bateman arrived. He did not approach, he did not make eye contact. He was simply there. Visible to someone looking. And Bateman was looking. Batman felt the weight of the attention across the room, the specific quality attention of someone who had been waiting for this and recognized it immediately when it arrived. He did not turn. He did not acknowledge. He finished his drink, paid, and left. Outside, in the cold air of the street, he processed what had happened in the room. He had felt watched, not with the routine awareness of a public figure in a public space, nor with the operational alertness of someone conducting surveillance who knows they might be surveilled in return. Something more particular. He had felt, and he examined this sensation with the careful honesty he applied to all information, including information that arrived from unexpected sources seen. Not identified, not assessed, not evaluated for threat level or social utility. Seen. In the specific way that meant, here is someone who is looking not at your surface but at what your surface is performing, and who finds the performance interesting. It was one of the most uncomfortable sensations he had experienced in recent memory. And he understood, walking back through the city with his hands in his pockets and the data reorganizing itself in his mind, why. He had spent years as the one who watched. He had never been in the position of being watched by something that operated without the usual inhibitions of the watcher, without guilt, without the self-consciousness of a person who knows that watching closely is a form of intimacy, and intimacy carries obligation. Bateman watched without any of that friction. He watched the way a very clear lens watches. Without judgment, yes, but also without the moral weight that made being watched by another human being something other than pure observation. It felt like being studied by something that did not yet have a word for what it was studying. I am aware that I have become part of his world in a way I did not intend. The line I am trying to hold, I am using his interest as access. His fascination with me is a door into the psychology I need to understand in order to stop him. The fact that he finds me engaging is a tactical advantage, not a complication. I am telling myself this clearly and consistently. I am also aware that the clarity with which I am telling it to myself is a sign that some part of my thinking has registered a complication. Because here is what is true. In 3 weeks of engagement, his project on Diana Jameson has slowed significantly. She is still in danger. The process has not stopped. It has paused. But she is more intact today than she would have been if I had not entered his environment. Which means my presence, my becoming interesting to him, has a protective function. Which means the most effective thing I can currently do for her safety is remain interesting to him. which means I need to sustain his attention. And sustaining the attention of a predator without becoming prey requires a calibration I am not certain I have fully thought through. The fourth week brought the first direct communication from Bateman's side. It arrived not through any channel Bateman had anticipated, not through an intermediary, not through a system he had established access to, not through any of the conventional pathways of correspondence. It arrived in the only way that could have reached him, which told Bateman something important about the quality of attention that had been directed his way. A card was left at a location that no one should have been able to connect to him. Bone-white cardstock, tasteful lettering, the kind of font that communicates both taste and authority. On the back, in a hand that was controlled and clear. You're studying the wrong question. You want to know what I am. More interesting, what are you? Bateman read it twice. Then he read it a third time. He was standing in a space that represented one of the most carefully guarded aspects of his operational life, and a piece of cardstock had been placed there by a man who should not have been able to find it. That was alarming. But what occupied his thinking more than the alarm was the question written on the back. Because it was not a taunt, it was not a threat, it was not the communication of a subject who had discovered their observer and was attempting to destabilize them with aggression. It was a genuine inquiry. Bateman wanted to know what Bateman was. And the unsettling thing, the thing Bateman sat with in the quiet of the space where he did his most serious thinking, was that the question had some legitimacy. In a world where justice operated as Bateman understood it, built on the foundation of moral weight and consequence, and the assumption of an interior capable of registering both, what was he? What did the role mean? What was its function in an environment where the usual assumptions did not hold? What was the detective in a world where crime was invisible? What was the avenger in a world where the villain felt nothing? What was justice in a world where the concept had no surface to grip? I have found 3 of his locations. Not the main one. I suspect the main one is better protected than anything I have the resources to penetrate, and I find that I am not especially motivated to penetrate it. That would end the question, and the question is what interests me. What interests me is this: he is a person who has constructed himself as completely as I have. The difference being that his construction is organized around a moral interior that he appears to experience as genuine. I watch him through the various access points I have developed, through the behavioral data I have accumulated, with the attention I usually reserve for projects, and I find something I did not expect. He is as alone as I am. Not in the same way. His aloneness is the aloneness of someone who has sacrificed the ordinary textures of human life in service of a purpose. Mine is structural, I lack the equipment for company. His is chosen, but the exterior shape is similar. 2 constructions moving through the world. His organized around meaning. Mine around the absence of meaning. I find this symmetry genuinely interesting. I find myself wanting to discuss it with him. I find this surprising. I almost never want things. By the end of the 5th week, Bateman understood that the investigation had changed shape entirely. What had begun as a conventional, if unusually challenging, attempt to identify, document, and stop a predator had become something else. It had become a confrontation between 2 incompatible models of what it meant to exist in the world. Bateman's model: existence has weight, actions have consequence. Justice is the mechanism by which consequence is returned to the person who generated it. The interior is real and the interior is answerable. Bateman's model, insofar as Bateman had a model, insofar as the organizing logic of his existence constituted a philosophy, rather than simply the operational parameters of a different kind of machine. Existence is surface. Actions are events. Consequence is a social construction applied by people who need it to be real. The interior, if it exists at all, is nobody's business but the person who may or may not contain it. These were not reconcilable positions. And Bateman understood, with the exhausted clarity of someone who has been thinking hard about something for a long time and has finally reached the thing the thinking was trying to reach, that this irreconcilability was the actual threat. Not Bateman. The irreconcilability. Because justice, as Bateman had practiced it, depended on a shared framework. It depended on the assumption that both parties to the application of justice were operating within the same basic understanding of what reality was and what consequences meant. Bateman was not operating within that framework. He was not rejecting it. He was not in rebellion against it. He simply existed in a different one entirely. And Bateman had no precedent for what you did when justice met something that operated outside the premises on which justice was built. He stood on a rooftop and looked at the city. Somewhere below him, in a restaurant he had already eaten, typified, Patrick Bateman was at dinner. He was performing the meal with the usual precision. He was being correctly social and correctly witty and correctly present. And he was thinking about the man on the rooftop. Bateman knew this the way you know certain things, not from evidence, though there was evidence, but from the accumulated understanding of weeks of close study. He knew that he was in Bateman's thoughts the way a problem stays in the background of a mind that has not yet solved it. He was the most interesting thing in Bateman's world. And that, he thought, staring out over the city with the wind coming off the water cold and sharp, was both his best current tool and his most dangerous current position. He was the stimulus that had displaced the threat. He was the puzzle that had paused the predation. He was, in the most precise and uncomfortable sense of the word, useful to Bateman. And he had to figure out how to use that usefulness before it was used against him. Or before the puzzle resolved. Because when the puzzle resolved, when Bateman had understood whatever he was working toward understanding about the man who had entered his world and rearranged it, the interest would fade. And when the interest faded, the project would resume. Bateman turned and looked at the door that led back down into the building. Act IV was coming. He needed to be ready for it. There are conversations that are not really conversations. They are collisions, two systems of understanding, two fundamental architectures of what it means to exist in the world, meeting in a space too small to contain both of them without one of them breaking. Not the ordinary collisions of disagreement, not the friction of two people who want different things, or believe different things, or have arrived at different conclusions from the same evidence. Those collisions have resolution available. Somewhere in the space between the positions, there is a place where the argument can land. The collision Bateman was walking toward had no such place. He knew this the way you know things that the mind has finished processing and delivered, without drama, as settled fact. He had spent weeks building toward this moment, and in the building had understood, with increasing precision, exactly what the moment would contain and what it would not contain. It would not contain resolution. It would not contain the satisfaction of a confrontation where one party was exposed and the other vindicated. It would not produce the clean narrative arc of justice applied and order restored. It would not end with anything that felt like an ending in the conventional sense, with the specific emotional completion that comes when a story's logic has been fulfilled. What it would contain was the truth. The complete, unmediated, unmanaged truth of what the investigation had found. And Bateman had learned, over a long life of learning hard things, that the truth was almost never satisfying. It was merely necessary. The location was chosen by Bateman. This was itself significant. Bateman had intended to choose, had prepared several options, had run the calculation of which environment gave him the most operational advantage while communicating the appropriate quality of seriousness. But the message had arrived, delivered through a method that continued to demonstrate, with a precision Bateman found both impressive and deeply concerning, the quality of attention that had been directed his way before he had made his selection. A penthouse, not Bateman's own, a property he had access to through a network of professional relationships that Bateman had documented but not fully mapped. Empty. On the 43rd floor of a building that offered the kind of view that existed for the purpose of making the city look manageable from a sufficient distance. The message had included a time. And one additional line. "Come as yourself." Bateman had read that line several times. He had understood it as both a practical instruction and a philosophical one. Practical. Bateman knew who he was. The civilian cover was unnecessary. The tactical costuming that served its purpose in other contexts would serve no purpose here. Philosophical. Come as the thing you actually are, not the thing you present to a world that needs the presentation. Come as the interior. If you have one. Bateman had dressed accordingly. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse. Bateman was standing at the window. He was dressed, as always, with a precision that functioned as its own form of statement, a dark suit, immaculate, the kind of presentation that communicated control over the immediate environment of the self. He did not turn when the elevator opened. He continued looking at the city. Bateman stepped into the room, and the elevator closed behind him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city was visible through the floor-to-ceiling glass, 43 floors of altitude, turning the ordinary chaos of urban life into something that looked from here like a circuit board, organized, geometric, the human density made abstract by distance. Bateman understood that Bateman had chosen this view deliberately. From up here, people were not people. They were patterns. "You took longer than I expected," Bateman said. His voice was what it always was in the recordings, controlled, precise, the voice of someone who had learned to use vocal tone as an instrument for producing specific impressions. But there was something different about hearing it in person, in a room, directed at him rather than at a social performance. Something slightly different in the quality of its attention. "I was making sure Diana Jameson was somewhere safe first," Bateman said. A pause. "Consider it," Bateman said, not sarcastically, as an assessment. He turned from the window, and they looked at each other for the first time without the mediation of distance or surveillance feed or the analytical buffer of observation. Directly, in the same room, the same air. Bateman had looked at a great many people across a great many confrontations. He had developed, across years of this, a sensitivity to the quality of being looked at, the specific character of another person's gaze, what it contained, what it revealed about the interior that was doing the looking. Bateman's gaze had a quality he had not encountered before. It was completely, purely attentive. No social management, no performance of the appropriate eye contact for the appropriate social context, No self-consciousness about the act of looking. He was simply looking, with the full, unmodulated directness of something that had no reason to soften its own observation. It was, Bateman thought, like being looked at by something that had not yet learned that looking directly was considered rude. Or had learned and found the learning irrelevant. Bateman internal. I have prepared for this. I have run the scenarios. I know what I want to accomplish. Not a confession, the evidentiary work is proceeding through other channels, and I do not need a confession. What I want from this conversation is something more specific. I want to know if there is any purchase, any surface on which consequence can grip. Because if there is, even a small one, even a place where something of what he has done has registered as real in a way that produces something, anything, that resembles recognition, then there is something to work with, something that the machinery of justice can engage with beyond the merely mechanical. And if there is not, if the interior is as absent as the weeks of observation have suggested, then I need to know that too. I need to know it completely, so that I know exactly what I am dealing with and exactly what justice, in this specific case, is capable of and is not capable of. I step further into the room. You've been thorough, Bateman said. He moved from the window not toward Bateman but laterally in the way of someone in a gallery moving along a wall, keeping the space of the room in his field of vision. The Turner file, Reese, Richards, the Jameson Project. He said the word project with the neutrality of someone describing a work assignment. You've built a complete picture. Almost complete, Bateman said. What's missing? You. Bateman stopped moving. He turned to look at Bateman with the same quality of full, unmodulated attention. I'm here, he said. You're present, Bateman said. That's different. Something happened in Bateman's expression. Not much. A fractional adjustment, the kind of micro-movement that most people would not register, and that Bateman had trained himself to read with the precision of someone whose survival had depended on reading them. It was interest. Not offense. Not defensiveness. Not the complex recalibration of someone who had been accurately seen and was now managing the exposure. Pure interest. Explain the difference, Bateman said. Bateman moved to the window. He stood beside Bateman, both of them looking at the city from 43 floors up. Presence is surface, Bateman said. You've been present your entire life. In rooms, in conversations, in relationships that other people believed were real. You were there. The body, the voice, the correctly calibrated responses. Present. And being somewhere is not the same as being, Bateman said. The version of you that has been in all those rooms, I've studied it for weeks. It's impressive. The execution is genuinely impressive, but it's a performance without a performer. Silence. The city hummed below them. Most people, Bateman said finally, would find that description offensive. You don't. No. Why? Bateman was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone gathering a response, manufacturing an appropriate reaction. The quiet of someone genuinely examining a question. Because, he said, it's the most accurate description of my experience that I have ever heard from another person. He is doing something I did not fully anticipate. I anticipated confrontation. I anticipated the application of moral pressure. The various forms of it I have observed and catalogued across a lifetime of watching people attempt to impose their ethical architecture on situations it was not designed for. I anticipated the detective's approach. Evidence, consequence, the structured argument for accountability. I did not anticipate accuracy. He is describing me accurately. Not from the outside, not the clinical description of a diagnostic category, the external mapping of behavior onto established frameworks. From the inside, he is describing the experience of being me with a precision that should not be available to someone who is not me. I find this extraordinary. I find that I want to understand how he arrived at it. I find that I want to continue this conversation for longer than I have wanted to continue any conversation in memory. Which is, I note with a detached interest, I apply to unusual data. New. The people you hurt, Bateman said, Turner, Reese, Richards, the others, and there are others, I know there are others. He kept his voice even, not accusatory, not the tone of a prosecutor constructing a case, the tone of someone who needs the answer to a genuine question. What were they? Bateman considered this with what appeared to be genuine attention. Problems, he said. Then, after a moment, no, that's not precise. Problems implies they created friction I needed to resolve. They didn't create friction. He paused. They were objects of interest for a time. And then, interest concluded. Bateman let that sit in the room. They were people, he said. You say that as if it's a category that automatically produces a certain kind of obligation, Bateman said, not defensively, analytically. I understand the argument. I can construct the argument myself. I've studied ethics extensively. I find it intellectually interesting. The framework in which personhood generates inherent worth, which generates obligatory treatment, which generates the concept of harm as a violation of something that matters intrinsically. He paused. I can construct the argument. I cannot make myself experience it as binding. Because you don't experience it. Because I don't experience it, he confirmed. You experience nothing, Bateman said. I experience surfaces, Bateman said. Aesthetics, functionality, the relative quality of things I experience. He seemed to search for the word stimulus and the absence of stimulus. And the people you hurt, they were stimulus. For a time, Bateman said, the most interesting stimulus I had found, in fact, the process of, he paused, selecting the word with visible care, reduction. It required attention, precision, the kind of problem-solving that engaged my actual capacity rather than just the performance of it. You found it engaging, Bateman said. Yes. And their experience of what you were doing to them. A pause. Registered, Bateman said, as data about the effectiveness of the method. Bateman internal. There it is. Not denial. Not the reframing of a guilty person managing exposure. Not the rationalization of someone who knows they did wrong and is constructing a narrative around the wrong. Simple, precise, accurate description of an interior that processes human suffering as information. Not because he is evil in the way the word is conventionally used. Evil implies a relationship with good, an awareness of the better thing, and a choice to pursue the worse. Evil is a moral category, and moral categories require the infrastructure of moral experience. He has no moral experience. He has experience. It runs on different equipment. And I am standing in a room with it, 43 floors above a city full of people who do not know it exists, and I am trying to find the thing I came here to find. The purchase. The surface on which consequence can grip. And I am not finding it. And I need to keep looking. Because the alternative, accepting that there is no such surface, has implications I am not ready to accept yet. You know what you are, Bateman said. I know what I am, Bateman confirmed. And you have no, Batman searched for the word that was precise enough, resistance to that knowledge. None. No part of you that wishes it were different. Bateman was quiet for longer this time. He turned back to the window. He looked at the city with the expression of someone solving a problem that is genuinely difficult for them. There is something, he said finally. I have not discussed it. I am not certain I can discuss it accurately, because it is the kind of thing that language was designed to describe in people for whom it means something different than whatever it means for me. Batman waited. Bateman said. Batman said nothing. There is an ambient insufficiency, not pain, not unhappiness, more like the persistent awareness. Assess that the frequency I am receiving the world on is missing something that the world appears to be broadcasting, that there is a signal everyone else is getting that I am not built to receive. He paused. I notice its absence most clearly when it recedes. When does it recede? Bateman turned from the window and looked at Batman directly. When something is genuinely interesting, he said. When the problem is real, when the engagement is not performance. A pause. Now, he said, it's not there now. Batman understood what was being communicated. Not an appeal, not manipulation, or not primarily manipulation. Bateman did not, as far as he could determine, have the sustained emotional investment in other people's responses that manipulation required. He was communicating data. He was describing, with the dispassionate accuracy of someone reporting an observation, what was happening in his interior in this specific moment. The conversation was the most stimulating thing he had experienced. Batman was the most interesting object in his world. And Batman needed to say something true into that, something that would do the work that needed doing, without the luxury of the usual tools. Fear would not work. Guilt would not work. Remorse was not a language Bateman spoke. What he spoke was accuracy, interest, the honest examination of a problem, the genuine engagement with something that resisted his usual methods of processing. So Batman gave him that. I'm going to tell you something true, Batman said. Not an argument, not a moral framework designed to produce a response in you, just a true thing. Bateman was still, listening with the complete, unmodulated attention of something that had nothing else to do but listen. The people you hurt, Batman said, they had something you don't, not better, not a moral achievement, just structurally present in them and absent in you. He paused. They could be damaged. I'm aware, Bateman said. I don't mean physically, Batman said. I mean there was somewhere for the damage to land. There was an interior, and the things you did landed there. They changed things. They broke things that don't grow back the way bones grow back. The damage was real and it was personal, and it changed the specific, irreplaceable interior of a specific, irreplaceable person in ways that cannot be undone. I understand the argument, Bateman said. I know you understand it, Batman said. I'm not making it as an argument, I'm telling you what it actually was, independent of what you were experiencing on your side of it. He turned to look at Bateman directly. You experienced a project reaching completion. They experienced the destruction of something in them that had been real and was now gone. Both of those things were true at the same time, in the same events. Bateman was quiet. I am aware, he said finally, that this is what you would call the relevant distinction. It is, Batman said. And you want me to what? Bateman said. Experience it retroactively. Develop the architecture that would allow the information to register as more than data. A pause. I can't do that. You know I can't do that. I know, Batman said. Then what is the function of telling me? This is the question. Not asked with hostility, not asked as a challenge or a deflection, asked with the genuine inquiry of someone who wants to understand the purpose of a thing that operates outside their framework. What is the function of truth-telling to someone for whom the truth cannot produce the response the truth-telling is designed to produce? And I have an answer. It is not a satisfying answer. It is the only honest answer available. The function, Bateman said, is not for you. Bateman waited. You've asked me what I am, Bateman said. Since the beginning, the note, the message, the question underneath every exchange we've had in whatever this has been. He paused. Here's the answer. He let the city be present for a moment. The vast, indifferent, ongoing city, 43 floors below, full of people experiencing things in the way that people experience things. I'm what it looks like when the world decides that the interior matters, Bateman said. When someone decides that the damage done to real people in real interiors is worth tracking through the dark and naming out loud even when the world has made it invisible, even when the person who did the damage cannot process the naming as anything other than data. He paused. I'm the part of the world that refuses to edit. Silence. That's not justice, Bateman said. Not yet, Bateman said. Justice is next. This is the premise. The premise that the interior is real, Bateman said. The premise that the interior is real, Bateman confirmed. That what happens inside people matters. That you cannot reduce a human being to a problem you solve without doing something that counts. That counting is not a feeling, it's a fact. It's real. Whether you can feel it or not. Batman internal. He is telling me that the reality of the damage does not depend on my experience of it. That the interior of another person is real in a way that is not contingent on my ability to register it. That the fact of their interiority is not negated by my inability to perceive it. I process this. I process it with the same quality of attention I have given to everything else in this conversation, which is more attention than I have given to almost anything else in my life, which is itself a data point I find worth noting. I cannot feel the argument, but I can understand it. And somewhere in the understanding, not deep, not where feeling would be if feeling were available, there is something. Not remorse. I do not have the equipment for remorse. Not guilt the same. But something. Something that functions like the recognition of a true thing. The specific, interior shift that occurs when something outside you corresponds exactly to something real. I am aware that they were real. I could not experience them as real while I was engaged with them. But I am aware now in this room, with this person who has described the problem with more precision than anyone I have encountered. They were real. And I am, the word is wrong, but it is the closest available, sorry is not right. Aware is closer. Aware, in a way I was not aware before, that the reality was real. Whether that counts for anything, I genuinely don't know. What happens now, Bateman said. It was not a question. It was an inquiry into a sequence he understood was about to unfold. The case is already built, Bateman said. It's been building for weeks through channels that have nothing to do with this conversation. The evidence is sufficient. The institutional machinery is going to begin moving within the next 48 hours. Bateman processed this. Diana Jameson, he said, is safe, Bateman said, and will remain safe. The others, the evidence pertaining to each of them, is part of the case. Bateman nodded, a single, precise nod. the acknowledgement of someone receiving information they have already, on some level, prepared themselves to receive. "And this conversation," he said, "what was it for?" Bateman looked at him for a long moment. "I needed to know if there was something there," he said, "beneath the surface, anything, because justice, the way I practice it, operates on the assumption that there is, that the person being held accountable is a person in the full sense. That consequence lands somewhere real. And I think," Bateman said carefully, "that there is something there, not what I would call an interior in the full sense, not a place where guilt or remorse has room to live, but something, the capacity to recognize a true thing, the capacity to understand, even without feeling it, that the damage was real." "Is that enough?" Bateman said. Bateman considered the question honestly. "For the machinery of justice, the institutional process, the legal accountability, no. That doesn't require your inner life. It requires your actions and the evidence of your actions, and those are documented." He paused. "For what I came here to know, whether you are a person in the sense that makes accountability meaningful beyond the merely mechanical, I think the answer is somewhere in the territory between yes and no." "That is an unsatisfying answer," Bateman said. "Yes," Bateman said, "it is." They stood in silence for a time. The city below them continued its operations with the cheerful indifference of a city that does not concern itself with conversations happening 43 floors above its surface. Bateman thought about the document he had written, the 11 days of trying to name what the investigation had taught him about the world, and about what justice meant in a world organized against its own premises. He thought about the ending he had not been able to write. Because there was no ending that resolved what the investigation had found. There was only the next thing. The arrest, the case, the institutional process, the newspapers that would describe Bateman in the language of monsters, which would be both accurate and insufficient, the public discussion that would last its allotted time and then be replaced by the next thing, the social world that had made him invisible, that would briefly, uncomfortably find him visible, and that would then, with the efficient self-repair of systems that have always protected themselves from disruption, return to the smooth management of its own surface. The world would edit him out, the way it had edited the others. The difference being that this time, the editing would come after the naming. After someone had stood in a room and said out loud, "This was real, and the damage was real, and the reality does not disappear because the world finds it inconvenient." That was not enough. But it was not nothing. Bateman internal. "I have been thinking, NG since the document, about the three endings. The identity collapse, the unsolvable enemy, the moral infection. I understand now that all three are true simultaneously. The identity collapse. When he is exposed, the world will process him through the machinery it has available, and then the machinery will return to its operational state, and the identity, the surface he constructed so carefully, will be dismantled not by justice, but by the world's desire to be done with what is uncomfortable. He will lose the recognition, the only thing he had. The unsolvable enemy. I cannot prove in the way that courts require proof the full depth of what he is. The evidentiary case addresses the actions. It cannot address the condition. It cannot make legible within the institutional framework the structural horror of a world organized to produce this and then obscure it. That remains unsolvable within the available frameworks. The moral infection. I have been changed by this. I came in with the clean confidence of someone who knew what justice was and knew how to apply it. I leave with the full, uncomfortable awareness that justice is a practice that depends on premises the world is continuously, unconsciously, undermining. That my work is not the application of a stable truth to a stable world. It is the ongoing effort to maintain the premise that the interior is real, that damage counts, that human beings cannot be reduced to the problems they solve or the surfaces they present, against a world that finds the premise inconvenient. I am not infected in the sense that I have abandoned the premise. I am infected in the sense that I can no longer hold it with the ease of someone who has never had to argue for it against something that simply does not include it in its operating framework. I know more about the ground I am standing on, including the ways in which it is not stable, including the ways in which the fight is not between me and the monsters, but between the premise I embody and the world that keeps producing reasons to abandon it. Bateman moved toward the elevator. He stopped at the edge of the room and turned back. Bateman was at the window again, looking at the city. The same posture as when Bateman had arrived, the controlled stillness, the precise distance from the glass, the expression that was not quite an expression. Looking at the 43-floor reduction of human life to pattern and geometry, and the abstract organization of a species too dense and complex to comprehend from the inside. "One question," Bateman said. Bateman turned. "The hum," Bateman said. "The insufficiency, the absence of the signal everyone else is getting." Bateman waited. "Does it bother you?" Bateman said. "Not morally, not in the framework of should or shouldn't, just does it register as something you would change if you could?" The longest silence of the conversation. Bateman looked at him with the full, unmodulated, completely honest attention of someone who has, for the duration of this exchange, been operating without performance. "I don't know," he said. "Why not?" "Because I don't know what I would be," he said, "if the hum were filled. I don't know if the thing that would be filled is continuous with what I am." He paused. "I would be a different person. I don't know if the person I am has a stake in the existence of the person I would be." Bateman looked at him. "That," he said quietly, "might be the saddest thing I have heard in a long time." "Sadness," Bateman said, "is a response that requires an interior sufficiently invested in a better alternative." "I know," Bateman said. He pressed the elevator button. "I know," he said again, to himself this time, to the document, to the investigation and everything it had produced and everything it had failed to resolve. The elevator opened. He stepped in. He did not look back. The doors closed. 43 floors descended in silence. Somewhere above him, a man stood at a window and looked at a city and felt, or registered, or processed, or experienced in the specific and limited way available to whatever he was, the first and final absence of the hum. Not peace. Not resolution. The specific, unfamiliar quality of a world in which something that had been interesting was about to become, through the operation of a machinery he had always known existed and now knew was in motion, simply over. Below him the city continued. Oblivious. Organized around its own surfaces. Editing, as it always had, the things it could not afford to see. And one floor at a time, descending through the building that had contained the conversation, a man who had spent weeks asking what justice was capable of, and who now knew the answer, not the answer he had wanted, but the true one, arrived at the lobby. Walked through the door. Into the city. Into the ongoing, unresolved, daily, necessary work of maintaining the premise against a world that would always find reasons to let it go. The confrontation that had no winner, the justice that was real but insufficient, the world that produced the monster and will produce the next one, the detective who walked out changed but not broken, still standing, still working, still holding the premise. That is the signature of a story that stays with people. Not the ones that resolve cleanly. The ones that end honestly.